A man spent 3 weeks tracking another man across the Texas Hill Country. No badge, no warrant, no backup, no salary. When he finally caught up and dragged his target into the county seat, the local sheriff looked him over and asked a simple question. How do I know this is even the right man? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Clay, and this is where we tell the real history of the American West. Not the cleaned-up version, not the movie version, the actual one. Today, we are talking about Wild West bounty hunters. Not the stylish lone wolf with the $1,000 wanted poster, the real men, the ones who tracked fugitives for wages that barely covered their expenses, operated in a legal gray zone with no formal name, and were sometimes more feared by the towns they rode into than the men they were chasing. If you are new here, hit subscribe. We do serious history, and we do not sand down the sharp edges. Stay with me to the end, because this story lands somewhere uncomfortable. Before there was a wanted poster, before there was a dead or alive reward nailed to a sheriff's door, there was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. That is where this story actually starts. The 1793 Act, and the far more aggressive revision passed in 1850, created something that had no real precedent in American law. A class of private individuals authorized by the federal government to pursue and capture other human beings across state lines for money. The targets were not outlaws. They were enslaved people who had escaped bondage and made it to free territory. The men who went after them were hired by slaveholders, worked on commission, and operated with powers that most official lawmen could not claim. They could enter homes without warrants. They could cross state lines freely. They could seize their targets and transport them hundreds of miles south.
And the law backed every step. These were slave catchers. That is the accurate term. And they are the direct ancestors of what Hollywood would later package as the romantic bounty hunter. Under the 1850 Act, the financial incentive was baked into the machinery of justice itself. The commissioner who decided whether a seized person was a fugitive slave received $10 if he ruled in the slave catcher's favor, and only $5 if he did not. The accused could not testify on their own behalf. They were not entitled to a jury. Free black men and women living in the North were seized regularly by slave catchers who either genuinely mistook them for someone else or did not particularly care about the distinction. This is the origin story of American bounty hunting. It is not a comfortable one, and it is almost never told this way. After the Civil War and the end of slavery, the machinery of private capture for pay did not disappear. It adapted. The West was opening up. The railroads were pushing across the plains. Banks were being robbed. Trains were being stopped at gunpoint. Territorial law enforcement was stretched impossibly thin. A single federal marshal might be responsible for territory the size of several eastern states combined. Into that gap stepped a new generation of private manhunters, now chasing criminals rather than freedom seekers. But the fundamental structure was the same: a private individual pursuing another person through whatever means were available for money, with minimal oversight. Here is where the Hollywood version begins pulling away from reality. True West magazine's Marshall Trimble, one of the most respected historians of the frontier era, has stated plainly that the lone, full-time bounty hunter as a profession barely existed. What was real was something considerably less cinematic. Most rewards were collected by sheriffs and marshals, supplementing their meager official salaries. Others were claimed by detectives working for the railroad companies and private agencies. Occasionally, private individuals of highly questionable background would chase a reward when nothing better was available. The numbers tell the story. A typical bounty in the early 1870s was around $100. Not 1,000, not 5,000, 100. Adjusted for today's purchasing power, that is somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000. Not nothing. But consider what it cost to earn it. weeks and sometimes months of tracking through some of the harshest terrain on the continent. Horses to feed, ammunition to buy, no lodging budget, no expense account. And at the end of the hunt, if the man you caught turned out to be the wrong person, or if the local sheriff decided he did not recognize the agency that had posted the reward, you ate the entire cost yourself and went home with nothing. The men who pursued rewards were, for the most part, men with few alternatives. Former cowboys with no cattle work, men who had drifted west ahead of their own legal troubles, failed miners, discharged soldiers with no trade to offer. The profession attracted exactly the kind of person you would expect when you offer money with no questions asked and no qualifications required. There was also almost no legal framework holding any of it together. A Supreme Court case from 1872, Taylor v. Tainter, established that those pursuing bail fugitives had broad powers to cross state lines and enter property without a warrant. But even that applied narrowly to bail situations. In practice, what a man pursuing a reward could legally do was decided on a case-by-case basis, county by county, town by town. Some sheriffs welcomed outside help. Others treated reward hunters as a problem of their own. And in a few places, the men who came in chasing a wanted poster were regarded by the local community as more dangerous than the man they were after. If any institution actually professionalized the pursuit of outlaws in the American West, it was not an individual, it was a corporation. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was founded in Chicago around 1850 by a Scottish immigrant named Alan Pinkerton. It became something that had no real precedent in American history. A private police force operating at national scale, funded by the companies that could afford to pay for what public law enforcement could not provide. Pinkerton's timing was near perfect. In the years after the Civil War, banks and railroads were expanding west at extraordinary speed, and so was organized crime. The Reno brothers executed what historians consider the first organized train robbery in 1866. Jesse James and his gang followed. Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch hit banks and trains from Wyoming to Utah. Local law could not pursue criminals across county or territorial lines. Federal marshals were spread too thin. The Pinkertons stepped into that vacuum and offered persistent, cross-jurisdictional pursuit backed by the financial resources of the corporations that hired them. The agency's logo, a wide-open eye above the words, "We never sleep," was not just a marketing choice. It was a promise to clients that where official law enforcement stopped, the Pinkertons kept going. For much of the 1870s and 80s, they delivered on that promise. They drove the Reno gang out of Indiana. They ran down train robbers across multiple states. They pursued Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid relentlessly enough to eventually push that pair all the way to South America. But their methods were not always clean, and the campaign against Jesse James stands as the most instructive lesson in what happens when private enforcement operates without real accountability. In 1875, Pinkerton agents traced Jesse James to his family's farm in Clay County, Missouri. Frank and Jesse were not there. They had been warned in advance. What followed during the raid on the farmhouse resulted in an explosion that killed the James brothers' 8-year-old half-brother and destroyed their mother's arm. The public backlash was swift and severe. The incident exposed something that ran through the entire history of private manhunting. When individuals act with the power of law enforcement but without its oversight, the consequences fall on everyone nearby, and no one with authority is necessarily held responsible. The Pinkerton Agency also served as a professional pipeline for some of the most dangerous men operating in the West. Tom Horn is the most instructive case. Born in Missouri in 1860, Horn had been a cavalry scout, had served as an Army interpreter during the campaign against the Apache leader Geronimo,
and carried a genuine reputation as one of the finest trackers in the region. The Pinkerton Agency hired him around 1890, and for several years he pursued train robbers and cattle thieves through Colorado and Wyoming. He was effective, feared, and increasingly indifferent to the distinction between bringing a man in alive and not. The agency eventually forced Horn to resign in 1894. Even by the standards of an organization with a flexible relationship to legal procedure, he had become too difficult to manage. He moved on to direct employment with wealthy Wyoming cattle barons who wanted a particular kind of result without the inconvenience of courts. He became, in the plainest terms, a hired gunman operating under the thin cover of range detective. Men he was assigned to deal with were found shot from a distance. No arrests, no confrontations, just results. And employers who preferred not to ask questions about method. Meanwhile, along the Texas-Mexico border, the pursuit of fugitives took a different shape entirely. The border was not a line so much as a corridor, a shifting zone where American warrants had no authority once a man crossed the Rio Grande, and where Mexican law had equally little reach going the other direction. Men who worked that corridor were operating in genuine legal nowhere. Some had arrangements with local authorities on both sides. Others acted entirely on their own judgment. When a pursuit ended badly, when a fugitive did not survive the trip back, the account given was typically that resistance had made it necessary, and there was rarely anyone positioned to contest the story. The wrong man problem was persistent and largely invisible in popular history. A wanted poster in the 1880s was a physical description, sometimes a rough sketch, occasionally a poor quality photograph. In territory where many men dressed similarly, avoided giving real names, and moved frequently, the margin for error was wide. There are documented cases of individuals with no connection to any crime being seized, transported far from home, and held for weeks before anyone unraveled the confusion. Some cases were never unraveled at all. Historians have found multiple instances of communities turning hostile toward reward hunters, not out of sympathy for the fugitive, but because the man in custody was plainly not the right one, and the person who had brought him in either could not or would not acknowledge the error. In 1875, a black man in his late 30s walked into the office of Federal Judge Isaac Parker in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and was commissioned as a Deputy United States Marshal. His name was Bass Reeves, and what followed over the next 32 years makes him one of the most remarkable lawmen in American history, and one of the most overlooked. Reeves had been born into slavery in Crawford County, Arkansas in 1838.
As a young man, he had been taken to Texas by his enslaver, where he worked the land, and later served as a personal attendant during the Civil War. At some point during the conflict, family history suggests it followed a violent confrontation, Reeves escaped into Indian Territory, the vast region that now makes up most of Oklahoma. He lived there for years among the Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole nations, learning their languages, their methods of moving through the land, and the craft of tracking in country designed to swallow a man without a trace. When the war ended and Bass Reeves was legally free, he bought land and farmed near Van Buren, Arkansas. He was 37 years old when Judge Parker's office came looking for someone who knew Indian Territory from the inside. Parker's jurisdiction covered more than 75,000 square miles of land, where tribal courts had no authority over non-tribal members, which meant, in practice, that anyone outside the 5 major nations could operate with near-total impunity. It was known to those who worked it as hell on the border. Bass Reeves knew it better than anyone alive. Over the following 3 decades, Reeves made more than 3,000 arrests. He killed 14 men in the line of duty, every one of them in circumstances he described as having been forced upon him. He survived more close calls than any fair accounting could justify, never taking a bullet despite being shot at on countless occasions. He used disguise with remarkable skill, once spending days posing as a field laborer to get close enough to arrest two wanted brothers without a violent confrontation. A single patrol out of Fort Smith might cover 800 miles and last several months, typically with a cook, a wagon, and one or two additional men. He could not read or write. He had someone read him the warrants before each journey, then memorized every name and description he needed to carry. He never misidentified a target.
He never arrested the wrong man. In 1902, a warrant came across his desk for a man charged with killing his wife. The name on the warrant was Benjamin Reeves, his own son. Bass Reeves took the warrant, rode out, and brought Benny in. There is no surviving account of what that journey was like. We know only that his son was convicted and sentenced to a federal penitentiary, and that Bass Reeves returned to his jurisdiction and continued working as he always had. He retired in 1907 and died 3 years later at the age of 71. Bass Reeves had a badge, a salary, a federal mandate, and a personal code that did not bend. He is the exception in this history. The Dunn brothers of Pawnee, Oklahoma, are rather more representative of what reward hunting actually looked like in practice. Bill, B., Dal, Calvin, and George Dunn ran a boarding house and a meat market. They were also, by most historical accounts, involved for years in cattle rustling and robbery before they turned to collecting bounties. Their sister Rose had become romantically involved with a man named George Newcomb, a member of the notorious Wild Bunch who carried a substantial reward on his head. On the 2nd of May, 1895, Newcomb and another Wild Bunch member rode up to the Dunn house to visit Rose. The brothers were ready for them. Both men were shot as they dismounted. The Dunns collected what was reported to be $5,000 apiece for each body. The story seems to end cleanly in most tellings. What it actually illustrates is something essential about the trade. The line between criminal and manhunter was not a bright one. The Dunn brothers had themselves committed the kinds of crimes that generated wanted posters. They used a family member's intimate relationship to arrange a situation where two men could be taken by surprise. They were paid handsomely for the outcome. And the law, satisfied with the result, did not press hard on the method. This was not unique. Across the frontier, the men most willing to pursue other wanted men were frequently those with their own histories on the wrong side of a wanted notice. Knowing how outlaws thought, where they hid, and how they moved was experience you did not accumulate by living a quiet life. And what do you think? Could you have lived with something like that? Not just the danger, but the moral weight of it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. By the time Tom Horn was hanged in Cheyenne, Wyoming on the 20th of November, 1903, the era that had produced him was already coming apart. Horn had spent the months before his execution in the county jail braiding rope, a craft he had learned as a boy. A Wyoming legend, probably embellished, holds that he braided the very rope used to hang him. What is documented is that he wrote his autobiography while waiting for the end, a book published after his death that most historians regard as unreliable and self-serving. He had attempted to escape in August of 1903, making it briefly into the streets of Cheyenne before a gathering crowd overpowered him and returned him to his cell. His last recorded words from the gallows were some version of a request to get it done quickly. The mechanism used was called the Julian gallows, a water-powered device in which the prisoner's own weight, combined with a draining barrel, triggered the trap without requiring a human hand on a lever. A machine designed to carry out a sentence at arm's length from the men who had ordered it. The debate over whether Tom Horn actually committed the murder of Willie Nickel has never been fully resolved. He had certainly caused other deaths in other situations,
by his own account and by the accounts of those who had paid him. But the conviction rested almost entirely on a confession that his defense argued was drawn out while Horn was drunk by a lawman who badly wanted a case. Many historians now conclude he may well have been executed for a killing he did not do, even while having carried out others. What is beyond serious dispute is that Horn went to the gallows without naming any of the men who had hired him, and that those men, the ranchers and cattle barons who had paid for his work for years, quietly stepped away when the law came looking. The rancher who had been his closest employer, John Coble, paid for Horn's coffin and his headstone. That was the full accounting. This pattern runs through the entire history of private manhunting in the American West. Someone was always paying, and the person paying was rarely the person called to answer for what happened. The slaveholders paid the slave catchers. The railroads paid the Pinkerton Agency. The cattle associations paid men like Tom Horn. When things went wrong, when an innocent man was seized, when a family's farmhouse was raided, when a young boy was shot on a hillside, the weight fell either on the individual who had done the work or on no one at all. The profession itself began to collapse in the years surrounding 1900, and for reasons that had little to do with moral reckoning. The expanding railroad network and the telegraph had fundamentally changed the geography of escape. A man could no longer ride 3 counties away and simply disappear into empty territory. His description could be transmitted instantly to every station and town along a rail line. State and federal law enforcement was being given real resources and real jurisdiction. The frontier, in the legal and geographic sense that had made private manhunting viable, was closing. The Census Bureau had formally declared in 1890 that a continuous frontier line no longer existed in the United States. The open ground that had made the entire trade possible was filling in. The men who had filled that gap drifted on. Some moved into legitimate law enforcement as the systems around them professionalized. Some found other kinds of rough work. Many ended up in circumstances that were not particularly good, which was always the statistical likelihood in a profession that attracted men with few alternatives and operated without oversight. What remained after all of them were gone was the mythology. The pulp novels of the 1930s and the Hollywood westerns of the 1950s rebuilt the bounty hunter from scratch. Independent, skilled, morally uncomplicated. An adventurer answering only to his own code. The real history, origins in slave catching, economic desperation, a legal gray zone wide enough to drive a wagon through, and a consistent habit of holding the man on the ground responsible while the men who signed the checks walked away untouched. That history was always harder to sell. But it is the real one. The question it leaves behind is not a comfortable one. When a private citizen is paid to pursue another human being and something goes wrong, a wrong man seized, an unarmed person hurt, a killing that no court ever authorized, who answers for it? In the American West, the answer was almost always no one of any real consequence. The man with the gun took the risk. The man with the money took the reward. Whether that has changed as much as we would like to believe is a question worth sitting with. If this kind of honest history is what you're here for, leave us a comment below. Tell us which story from the Old West you think deserves a closer look. We read every one, and there is no shortage of ground left to cover.